Good morning. How's everyone this morning? I guess everyone else went to the 1E party last night, right? Okay, this is the session on System Center 2012 Unified Installer. I am Rob Willis. I am a Principal Program Manager in the System Center engineering team. And I'm the guy that was given the really interesting task, the really interesting assignment of putting together this thing called the Unified Installer for System Center 2012. My goal this morning is to help you understand what it is, what it does, what it doesn't do, and also explain a lot of the thinking behind why we put it together the way we did. It was an interesting challenge that we've never really tackled before. So I want to start with a few questions, and just feel free to shout out your answers to these, if the clicker works. How many products are there in System Center 2012? 8? 7? 5? The answer a year ago was too many. The answer today is 1. System Center 2012 is licensed and sold as a single product. And there's an awful lot of functionality, of capabilities in that one single product. So how long does it take to install System Center? And yes, I mean all of System Center. Too long? 1 hour? Wow. That's some smoking fast hardware you got there. So the TechNet guy is sat back here. I know I went to your session the other day about the lab we put together. How long did that take to install all of System Center? A week? Okay. Too long is actually a really good answer. I've been talking about this internally and with some partners for about a year now, and the answer typically comes anywhere from a week, a couple of weeks, month. Really depends on who's doing it, but absolutely too long. Why does it take so long? So my take on it is the reason it takes so long is you have no management software to install it with. This really is the chicken and egg problem, right? We're giving you management capabilities that can do things such as configuration management, software distribution, but until you have that, it's hard getting those pieces in place. So this is an interesting one. If you were to do a basic installation of all 7 components of the one product System Center 2012, including all of the prerequisites, including SQL Server, with a single server dedicated to each component, how many screens do you click through? Just take a guess. 75? Over 100? 422. I counted them. Of those 422, how many of them are the actual System Center components itself versus how many of them are the prerequisites in SQL Server? I'm sorry? 75 for System Center? 75 screens or 75%? 75 screens. Okay? That's actually not too far off the mark. It's 300 screens for prerequisites in SQL and 122 for System Center. So getting all the prerequisites laid down, getting SQL Server set up is a big part of the deployment challenge. Okay, and then bonus question, especially for this particular conference, which again, my clicker doesn't work. Who has a private cloud in their pocket? We all do. My manager and I were actually the ones responsible for putting this thing together. He persuaded the powers that be to pay for it, and I put the layout together. But this USB key that's in your conference bag with all of System Center and the prereqs and SQL was put together specifically, laid out specifically to work with the Unified Installer. So we really wanted to help you get to the point where you can try this great new functionality, all this new capability we have in System Center 2012 as quickly as possible, including skipping the downloads. And I know for the international attendees, that can actually be a pretty major challenge. So, what we're going to talk about this morning, very simply, why are we doing this? We'll talk about the difference between product, components, roles, prerequisites, how all these things come together. We'll talk about the architecture of System Center 2012 Unified Installer and why we made some of the decisions we made. We'll go through a demo. The demo will not complete. We don't have time in a 1 hour 15 session for it to actually complete, but we will go through a demo, talk a little bit about troubleshooting, and we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. If you have questions as we're going through this, feel free to step up to a mic, ask, or raise your hand, and we can get those addressed as we go through. So, why are we doing this? Very simply, this is to simplify the installation of System Center 2012 initially for a very specific scenario, and that is for evaluation, testing, proof of concept purposes. We're releasing a huge amount of technology, a huge amount of capability, and we want you to be able to try it very easily. We don't want you to have to struggle through a lot of the experiences that I know these guys talked about in their session the other day about what it takes to actually get all this stuff up and running. We want you to get it all in place as quickly as possible so you can actually spend your time on something more valuable, evaluating functionality, rather than trying to understand how to get the thing stood up in the first place. So let's talk about what is involved in System Center. System Center 2012 is a single product. You buy one thing, it's System Center 2012, you get all of these components. These are the things that we formerly thought of as products, plus some new stuff. But System Center 2012 consists of these 7 components. But it's a little more complex than that. Actually, each one of those components has a number of roles. This list is not an exhaustive list of all the roles in System Center 2012. This is simply the list of roles that can be installed by using the core setup of each one of these components. There's actually around a dozen or so, at least a dozen or so more roles than this, most of them related to Configuration Manager. But these are the things that if you run the core setup of each one of these components, you can actually go and install. But it's a little more complex than that. There are prerequisites involved in getting those roles stood up. Note the last bullet. This also is not necessarily a complete list. It depends on what version of the operating system you're installing on, a couple other factors in there as well. To further complicate this, you have to go and get a lot of these yourself individually. We do not necessarily ship these with the components themselves. That's a really large part of the reason that we put this USB key together. So you've got everything you need in one place to go and do it. Otherwise, you'd have to go and figure out which of these you need, where to get them from, make sure you have the right versions. It's a lot of pre-work that we really wanted to help you skip. So our goal is to make it much easier to consume System Center 2012 as a single product, seen as when you get it, you get all of it. So what does it actually take to go and install System Center today? This list actually came from my manager, who is a really sharp guy, but when he first came to Microsoft, it was actually about the same time I joined. SMS 2003 had just been released, and he went through this exercise of, okay, how do I actually go and try this out? So what do you have to do? First, you have to go out and download all the bits, right? So the bits for System Center itself, the bits for prerequisites, etc. Then you have to go and log on to each server that you're going to install some part of that component or that product on. Install the prerequisites, if you can figure out what they are. More likely, you run setup, and you go through a couple of screens, and it says, you're missing .NET Framework 4.0. So you go and you find .NET Framework 4.0 and you install it, and then you go through a couple of screens again. It says, now you're missing, and it comes up with something else. So several passes on this attempt to install prerequisites. Then you install SQL. This, in our analysis, we actually found to be one of the most, the major challenges that a lot of our customers face is getting SQL right. Right? So either you set it up yourself, and certainly speaking from my own experience, having been in this space for quite a long time, I'm not a SQL guy. Over time, I've learned enough about it to make it work right for the management tools and products that I work with every day, but I'm really not a SQL guy. So you go and install SQL, and then you try and install the component. It says, but you're missing reporting services. So you go and add reporting services, several passes again to get SQL right. But this is really one of the things that we found a lot of our customers have significant challenges with, is getting this piece right. Then depending on what you're doing, you may go and configure some prerequisites as well. If you're installing the web console for Operations Manager, for example, it's not enough just to have IIS installed. There's some other configuration you need to go and do so that it actually works with Operations Manager. Then you create some service accounts. Then you try and figure out what permissions those service accounts need, right? Which ones do I need to make an administrator of the local system, maybe some remote systems? Which ones need access to SQL? Which ones don't? How do I go and put all that together? Then you install a server role. The first server role, in a lot of cases, there's subsequent roles that you may want to go install as well. So then you go and install those. Then you do some integration, either within the product itself, within the component you're working with, or between components, or from the component you're installing to some other external product or capability you're using. Then you install a console, sometimes the console's installed for you, sometimes you have to go and install it separately. Then you install some agents, and finally, after all of that, you get to manage something. Too complicated. We're trying to simplify this. So our goal here is to provide a single user interface, a single experience for System Center 2012 that allows you to get everything you need installed, including prerequisites and SQL, specifically for evaluation and proof of concept scenarios. The reason we highlight that is there is a lot of decisions you need to make for a true enterprise deployment. We're not aiming to do that enterprise deployment for you. You still need to go through the planning documentation. You need to sit down and figure out how it best fits in your infrastructure, in your organization, to meet the needs that you want to actually meet with that particular product or component. But for evaluation purposes, we want to get you a simple installation so you can very quickly start to look at that functionality. To do that, we need to do a distributed installation from a central point. Right? One of the interesting challenges with full System Center 2012 deployment is it is absolutely not possible to run all of those components on a single operating system instance. You can run them on a single server if you're using virtualization, of course, but it's not possible to run all of those components on a single OS. So to do this single experience for deployment of evaluation of System Center, we have to be able to do a distributed installation from a central point. The way we're doing this is actually using the existing component setups. We did not rewrite or replace setup in any way. So when you're doing the production deployment, you still use setup. If there's some part of functionality you want to evaluate that's not met by the unified installer, the way we do our configuration, our setup, you still use that existing component setup. All we do is wrap the silent installs of each one of those components and prerequisites. So our scope for version 1 of the unified installer was for new installations only. We are not going to attempt to address upgrades. There's too many things that could have happened. There's too many potential deployments of previous versions of the components that are now in System Center 2012 for us to attempt to automate upgrades in this way. We did limit our scope to Windows Server 2008 R2 SP1 only and SQL Server 2008 R2 only. Again, with new installations, we felt that that was going to be the very likely platform that everybody would use. So to limit the amount of testing and the variables that we had in our development, we limited our scope to those versions. That's not to say that some components of System Center can't run on previous versions of either Windows Server or SQL Server, but for the purposes of the unified installer, we do need Windows Server 2008 R2 SP1 and SQL Server 2008 R2. And we're doing this as a central data installation. We're not doing a distributed installation. Again, it's meant for evaluation, not for production deployment. So if you are putting in place a distributed configuration manager infrastructure, we'll do the central data center portion of that, but further deployment of management points, distribution points, other sites is secondary to the unified installer experience. I'm going to give up on this clicker. So, when you run standard component setup, what do you typically do? You log on to a server and you run setup. Setup installs a bunch of bits on that server and then may also either create or access a database on a remote server. This is one of the really interesting challenges in automating this in a distributed fashion, is the fact that we have that double hop authentication challenge. So I need to be able to say, install Orchestrator on this server over here, but have it access a database on some other server. In remoting technology, that is an interesting challenge. So this is the part where I want to try and explain how we chose to do this, why we chose to do it the way we did. The requirements we had for putting this together were a workflow capability that allowed us to sequence the steps that have to happen across multiple servers from that central point, a remoting technology that allowed us to reach out to one of those remote servers and initiate execution of setup on that, but then also credentials delegation that in that remoting we were able to further reach out and access some other server. There are a number of ways we could have done this. WMI remoting is one way, so I can start a process on a remote system using WMI. It does not have the credentials delegation capability that we needed. We could have used something like PSExec, the tool that's part of sysinternals. It actually does have credentials delegation capabilities, but there's some interesting issues around that, and we know that some anti-malware products still actually identify PSExec as malware. We certainly didn't want to run into that. We could have used WinRM. So Windows Remote Management has the ability to remote execute a task, and with CredSSP has the ability to do that credentials delegation to go to a further server. We could have used Orchestrator and the run program activity within System Center Orchestrator, which is a slightly modified version of PSExec, but there's some interesting challenges in supplying credentials to Orchestrator to allow it to actually use that for credentials delegation. So what did we actually do? Our choice, the answer that we chose, was to use Orchestrator and WinRM. So what we actually did was said, Orchestrator is our workflow capability. It's our runbook automation capability. It's the best thing we have to actually control the process of the installation. But we need to get Orchestrator in place first. So how do I do that? We chose to use WinRM to bootstrap Orchestrator, insert runbooks into Orchestrator, and then call those using the Orchestrator web service to continue and do the rest of the installation. And I'll explain in a little bit more detail exactly how we did that, because it's not as simple as the Orchestrator run program object. So here are the phases that we go through, you'll see in the demo here in a moment. So we start out with an interview. This is a simplified set of inputs that we need to understand the evaluation deployment that you're about to do. So it's not all 422 screens, it's actually 16. So we've taken that experience of evaluation deployment from 422 screens down to 16 using Unified Installer. Then we bootstrap Orchestrator and the prereqs for Orchestrator using WinRM. So we install SQL, we install .NET 4.0, we install Orchestrator. We also then install an Orchestrator runbook server on every server that you're targeting part of this deployment to. And that's actually how we get our credentials delegation. We didn't use any of the technologies I just listed. We used the Orchestrator runbook server to actually go and do the work. That way we don't have to provide Orchestrator with credentials. The service that the runbook server runs as has those credentials, and it effectively acts as a local login when we're installing something on that system, so it has the ability to actually reach out and connect to some other system. There is then a transition, and this was one of the hardest parts to do with Orchestrator, was once we got Orchestrator in place, we need to get the runbooks into Orchestrator that will then go and complete the rest of the installation, and then call that using the Orchestrator web service. Inserting runbooks into Orchestrator was something that we hadn't really addressed before, so we actually have a utility within the Unified Installer that will do that insertion of runbooks for us. Then we call the web service, and give it the information that we need to do the rest of the deployment, and it goes through, installs the prerequisites, installs SQL, and installs the rest of the components. So a graphical way to look at this, you run the interview. It creates what we call a deployment pack. A deployment pack is an XML file that stores information about the deployment you're about to go and do. That is actually persisted on the machine that the installer runs on. So if I go through and run through the interview again, the answers from the first time through will still be there. So when I'm providing it with things such as source paths, server names, if I go and add to my deployment later, if maybe I chose not to do one of the components the first time through, those answers will still be in place. Then there's a workflow actually within the Unified Installer itself, uses WinRM, installs SQL Server 2008 R2, installs Orchestrator on either the system you're running the installer from or some other system. So the installer itself has to be run on either the server that is going to be the Orchestrator server or some system that is not going to be part of the deployment. It can run on Windows Server 2008 R2 SP1. It can also run on Windows 7 x64 SP1. So if you want to run it from your workstation, control installation to a set of servers, you can do that. Once those runbooks are in place, we call them and we can currently go through and install the rest of the components. So let's switch to a demo and show you what this looks like. So this is what you get when you run Unified Installer, either from the key that we provided you in your conference bags, or if you've gone and downloaded it. What I have here is essentially a layout that is a copy of the USB key that you used. I have some extra stuff in here that I'm working with, but this is basically what is on your key. There are two choices on this main screen: Install System Center and Custom Install on Local Server. Custom Install, all it does is ask you which component it is you're installing, and then prompts you for the source location for that component and runs interactively the setup for that component. What we wanted to do was provide you with a single entry point to install everything. So if when the screen comes up in a moment here that explains that Unified Installer is doing a testing, evaluation, proof of concept installation, if that's not what you want to do, run a custom install, you can go straight here to go and run it. The reason there's a delay here is the number one piece of feedback we got from the beta and the release candidate. Beta for Unified Installer was internal only to Microsoft. Release candidate was publicly available with everything else when we announced System Center 2012 as a single product. The single biggest piece of feedback we got was that the WinRM configuration that we require is not default, and we didn't necessarily check very well that WinRM is appropriately configured. So when I hit Install System Center here, what it's doing is making sure that the system I'm running the installer on is appropriately configured for the client side of that WinRM configuration. And once it's done that, it'll pop up this dialog box, which everybody reads every single time before they hit OK, right? Basically says, this is a proof of concept, this isn't a production deployment. Now you don't have to read it. Okay. Then we start going through the interview. There are a number of license terms screens on this, and I'll explain exactly why that is as we go through here. But this is the default license terms screen you see for everything. You can choose to install this either as an evaluation edition or as a licensed installation. If you're using the USB key, you have to do it as an evaluation edition, right? Almost all of the bits for System Center 2012 are identical between evaluation and licensed. The only difference is whether you provide a key or not, but it's not true across the board. So the bits that we put on the key actually are the evaluation bits. So choose to install it as an eval, accept the license terms. Then choose which components you want to install. By default, we want you to install everything. We want you to try all of the functionality, but you can choose not to do certain things if you want. Each one of these has a little drop down that explains what that component is. This is intended for evaluation purposes, so somebody that's new to System Center might come in here and say, I have absolutely no idea what I want. So we have a little description for each one of those. There is some logic in dependencies in here. So I can't choose to say, I don't want Virtual Machine Manager if I still have App Controller selected, because App Controller is dependent on Virtual Machine Manager, and so we don't allow you to deselect that unless you first deselected App Controller. We do allow you to deselect Orchestrator, but if you do, it won't work. Okay, let me explain that one. So if you already have Orchestrator in place through the Unified Installer, you don't have to install it again. You can just say, here's my Orchestrator server that I previously installed with the Unified Installer, use that to do something else, right? So it is, logically, you can deselect Orchestrator, but if this is your first time through, don't deselect Orchestrator, it will not work. So I'm going to just choose to do everything. Then we start prompting for the source locations. The download, if you would go to the volume license site or the evaluation site, Microsoft Download Center, to download System Center 2012, there is a single download on evaluation. On volume license, it's 8, I think 9 individual downloads. But they don't come as a single source that says, here's System Center, point to this folder, that's going to install everything. That's why we put this together, so you do have that in one place. But we can't predict where all these things exist, so we're just going to prompt for the location of each one of those. This is a deployment that I've run through before, so I've already answered these. The first time you get to this screen, it would typically be blank, and you just need to go and find all of them. We do validate that whatever you enter is correct, so if I put in an incorrect path, or if I point to the wrong source, if I say this is orchestrated, but I'm actually pointing to Operations Manager, we'll validate that. We also validate that it is at least the RTM build of each one of those components. So because we do everything silently, if we didn't do that, it would be possible for you to go and install a pre-release milestone, such as a release candidate, and you'd never know it because you never see the big splash screen that says, this is release candidate. So we are very careful that we validate each one of these paths so that we're actually getting the correct input media to do the deployment. Then we get to some of the interesting license term screens. There are actually 2 further license term screens, and I really want to explain why these are there. This one, anybody that's installed Configuration Manager 2012 will recognize this screen. This is a new one that was put in for Configuration Manager, and we were required to add a unified installer because we're installing Configuration Manager. The reason this is separate from the others is Configuration Manager does a slightly different thing with some of its prerequisites. It not only installs them, it stores them for further deployment to other systems. So the text on this screen is explaining that you're accepting these license terms for the purpose of further deployment of these components using Configuration Manager when I'm doing something such as deploying a reporting services point or a distribution point, etc. Then there's another screen. So each one of these is dependent on which components you've picked. Right? So if I didn't pick, for example, if I didn't pick Operations Manager, I wouldn't be prompted for the license terms for a report viewer. We only prompt you for anything that we need for what you're doing. But we have to have you accept each one of these license terms for the prerequisite components that are being installed as part of that System Center deployment. Our developer, and he might be in the room, didn't see whether he stepped in or not. A developer wanted to add a select all button, agree to all on this screen. I wanted to do it too, we just weren't allowed to. Then we're prompting for the media location for each one of those prerequisites. So again, if I hadn't selected, for example, VMM, I wouldn't be prompted for Wake. If I hadn't selected Configuration Manager, I wouldn't be prompted for Service Pack 1 or Cumulative Update 4 for SQL Server. We only prompt for the things we need. And again, we validate each one of these. So if I pick one of these incorrectly, it's going to tell me that's not the file or the media that I need. Configuration Manager is an interesting one. So I said in the scope that we're doing Windows Server 2008 R2 SP1 and SQL Server 2008 R2. Those of you that have worked with Configuration Manager 2012 know that it has a very specific requirement for SQL Server 2008 R2 SP1 Cumulative Update 4. So we had to ask you for the media for those. We only install that on the Configuration Manager SQL box. We don't install that on the others. It is supported for the others, but it's not a required part of the installation, so we actually skip those if you're not installing Configuration Manager. The way we do the check on these is we're actually checking a minimum build version in the setup for each one of these prereqs, which means that if, for example, Configuration Manager now decides that really they'd prefer you use Cumulative Update 6 than Cumulative Update 4, which I believe they've actually just done, you can give this the media for CU6, and it actually will still work. Yes? Okay. So the question was, will this work with SQL 2012? No, it will not. So the System Center 2012 components were not tested with SQL 2012. It's a development timeframe type thing. They may or may not work, but they're not supported on SQL 2012 today. We are working on that, but today we require SQL 2008 R2 for System Center 2012. So no, this might work with SQL 2012, but it is not supported. Good question. Yeah. The question was, can you use an existing SQL installation? You can, but you have to be very specific about the installation of it with the Unified Installer. So really, for Unified Installer purposes, it's not supported to use an existing SQL. Again, this is intended for evaluation purposes. When you get to a production deployment, a lot of production deployments use existing SQL farms, SQL clusters, and absolutely all of the System Center components support doing that. But for the Unified Installer, we prefer that we install it. If you happen to have SQL Server on one of the systems you're targeting for this, and it's the right version, and it's configured exactly the right way, we'll actually just skip the installation and use it, but it's not something that we've really documented how to go about doing that. The intent here is we're doing the whole thing start to finish. Again, it's a good question. So then I'm going to pick which servers I want to install these components on. We require a separate operating system instance for each one of the components 2 for Service Manager. Service Manager has a separate management server versus its data warehouse management server, which can't be installed on the same OS instance, so we require a total of 8 systems. We do not allow you to combine these. That's not to say that System Center itself doesn't allow combination of some of these. Some of them can be installed together. Some of them absolutely cannot be installed together. For example, Operations Manager and Service Manager absolutely cannot be installed on the same system. Technically, it is not possible. Some of them can be installed on the same system, but won't completely work if you install them on the same system. So what we chose to do to simplify this for evaluation purposes is just say we require a separate system for each one of these components, a total of 8. Typically, we're seeing this done virtualized on very often a single Hyper-V host. Incidentally, we don't require that it's virtualized. We don't require that it's Hyper-V. These systems can be virtualized, Hyper-V, VMware, Xen, you name it, they can be physical. We have no dependency on the underlying hardware or virtualization platform. That was a very specific choice we made up front as well, because we didn't want to limit the applicability of this just to customers that were using Hyper-V. So we fill in each one of these servers. Again, there's a pause here. At this point, we're checking that each one of these systems meets a set of criteria. We're checking that it exists. You didn't fat finger the name of the server. We're checking that you have administrative access to it so we can actually go and perform an installation. We're checking that it's appropriately configured for the server side of WinRM. We are checking that it is the same language version, the same locale as the system you're running the installer from. Unified Installer is available only in English. However, it can install non-English System Center components. To do that, all of the systems being involved in that deployment have to be the same language version. So if I'm running on a Japanese version of Windows here, each one of those systems that I'm checking to make sure that they're also Japanese. Right? It has to be the same locale. Unified Installer is in English only, but it will install language versions of each one of our components. Then we're prompting for service accounts. Our default is you're doing this for evaluation. You're probably not really concerned about security of the evaluation itself. So we will prompt you for a single service account. And we do, if you're using that, we do require that that is the account that you're logged onto the system that you're running the installer from. So I could also choose to say, no, I want to specify a separate service account for each one of the service accounts involved. Those can all be completely different. We still have the installer account requirement, which has to be the one you're logged in as, but it doesn't actually get used as a service account for anything. I'm going to say use one, enter the password, if I can remember what it is. We validate that account exists, the password is correct, and then continue. If you're using a single service account, because we've already checked that you have admin access to all of those systems we're deploying to, we already know that that has admin access to everything. If you're using multiple service accounts, it's only the installer account that needs permission. We will add the other service accounts the appropriate permissions they need for the component they're installing. So taking out the complexity of you having to understand what needs permissions where. Then we prompt for component-specific questions where management group names or site codes are relevant. Yes? So the question was, what rights do we need in the domain? We don't need any rights in the domain. Just the installer account has to be a domain account, but it's just a regular user account. We don't need any permissions to AD. We chose not to do any of the AD configuration because we knew that in a lot of organizations we wouldn't get that type of access, so we'd be made irrelevant. So where there's component-specific management group names, etc., we're asking for those. These are defaulted. You can change them, but these will actually come up as a default selection when you run through this. Then standard communications and updates. Do you want to use Microsoft Update, Customer Experience Improvement Program, error reporting? Summary screen that says this is what you've just chosen to do. Then when you hit install, it actually starts. And between an hour and a half and 4 hours later, it's done. Just like that. So we're actually not going to watch that complete, but I am going to show you what it looks like. It does take a while to actually go. The fastest I've seen it complete, and this is on the fastest test system that I actually had available, it was done in just under an hour and a half. On the more typical systems that we used in our testing, it was typically 2.5, 3 hours. If it's on a really heavily loaded virtualization server that maybe doesn't have a great disk storage, doesn't have great I/O available, it can take up to 4 hours. What you're actually going to see happen is these progress bars will progress for each one of the 7 components. Which one's going to win? This is progress bar races. We had great sport with this during development on seeing who's going to win. Yes, absolutely. Orchestrator's going to win, of course, first time, because we bootstrap it first. Who's going to be second? App controller? I'm sorry? Virtual Machine Manager has to be first? Yeah, actually it is Virtual Machine Manager. Anything that involves installing .NET 4.0 is, anything that doesn't involve installing .NET 4.0 is typically going to be faster because .NET itself takes a little while to install. And Virtual Machine Manager is actually one of 2 on here that doesn't require .NET in any way. So what you're going to see happen, I did this presentation at our internal technical training, and I didn't tell them that I'd switched the screenshots, and somebody went, wow, that's installing really fast. And I pointed out that I can actually make it go backwards too. These are screenshots. I'm not trying to fool you into thinking this is actually a deployment. It doesn't happen this quickly. But what you're going to see happen is Orchestrator will install first, and you see we have, I can't put my mouse on there, you'll see there's a little message on that progress bar that says exactly what it's doing on each step of the way. So it goes through, it installs .NET Framework 3.5.1, installs the IIS web server, installs .NET Framework 4.0, installs SQL, then installs Orchestrator, and then he's done. Okay, so that one goes first. Then we have a bootstrap on each one of the other systems that we're actually installing to. What that is installing the runbook server on that system so we can then target that runbook server with tasks in our Orchestrator runbooks to actually go and complete the deployment. These happen sequentially. So you'll see that we do a couple of things, and then sequentially you'll see each one of these servers go through their bootstrap. This is still single-threaded actually in the unified installer. Each one of those will go through their bootstrap. The progress bar for Service Manager will be slightly longer because there's 2 servers involved in Service Manager. And then they will start going concurrently. On each one, you'll see exactly what it's doing every step of the way, so it checks to see whether what we need is installed. If it's not, it installs it. That's actually where we get the existing SQL capability, if you actually want to try and figure that out. Everything we do, every single step of the way, we check to see whether what we're about to do is already there or not. If it isn't, we'll go and install it, but if it is, we just skip it and move on to the next step. That's actually how we get the second stage of deployment. If I'm saying, if I've done all this, I've installed everything, but I didn't install Operations Manager, and I want to go back through a second pass and say, now I'm installing Operations Manager, I still have to tell it where my Orchestrator server is. And the workflow is actually exactly the same. It checks to see whether everything it needs to do for Orchestrator is there, and if it's not, it'll do it. But because everything's already there, it'll just skip straight through the Orchestrator install and move straight on to whatever other component it was you chose to install. So over the course of the several hours this takes, if you're watching it, you'll actually see them go from installing SQL, installing prerequisites, to actually component installation running. So there you see Virtual Manager is completed. I can't remember who came second. Who's going to come second? There you go, Data Protection Manager. It's the other one that doesn't need .NET 4.0. Data Protection Manager does have a mandatory reboot in almost every single scenario. When you enable single instance storage for Data Protection Manager, it requires a reboot. So unless you happen to already have single instance storage enabled on the server that Data Protection Manager has been installed to, we will reboot the Data Protection Manager server during the course of installation. And then you'll see each one of the other components install. Who's going to come last? Service Manager? You would think so, but I don't think that's right. Actually, it typically is Configuration Manager. The reason being, Configuration Manager, not only does it need .NET 4.0, it needs SQL, it needs SQL SP1, it needs SQL SP1 CU4. So effectively, we're doing 3 full passes of SQL installation against the Configuration Manager server, which is why it tends to be last. The Configuration Manager install itself is relatively quick, but all the prereqs are a little complex. So it completes. There is then a post-setup cleanup. So what we're doing there is actually going and removing the runbook server from those target servers. We don't want to leave 8 runbook servers in place, because if you start using Orchestrator, you'll find runbooks actually executing in places that you might not want them to execute. So we clean up after ourselves. We remove the Orchestrator runbook servers from each system that we've installed to, give you a nice little summary that says what's happened, and you're done. There are things that you have to do after that is complete. To really evaluate System Center as a single product, there are still some post-setup integration tasks that you need to go and run. We do not automate those. I mentioned at the beginning, my goal is to tell you what we do and what we don't do. Part of what we don't do is production deployments, but another part of what we don't do for evaluation purposes is the post-setup integration. So there is actually a link at the end here that says click here for next steps. What that will do is take you to the TechNet library documentation for each component, which has the information about what post-setup integration you actually need to go and do. So this is things such as connecting Virtual Machine Manager to Operations Manager for performance and resource optimization purposes. Things such as connecting Service Manager to Operations Manager, Configuration Manager, Virtual Machine Manager, and Orchestrator for purposes of population of the CMDB, and for things such as initiating runbooks from within Service Manager service requests. There are a number of steps you still need to do, and I want to make sure you understand that you need to do those, because you are not evaluating full functionality unless you've been through that. We don't do them, but we do point to the documentation of where you actually need to go and do that. So, a couple of things that are really important before you start. Read the user's guide. I had a bet with my manager that when we released the release candidate, the public release candidate, that nobody would ever run through all of Unified Installer without having read the user's guide, because the WinRM configuration we require is not default. And because we're checking for that and we're stopping you from continuing before you have that correct, everybody's going to have to read the user guide to understand what that is so that they can actually get past that step. Our checks and release candidate didn't work, so I lost that bet. But they are in there now, so unless you happen to have WinRM with CredSSP already configured in your environment, you're going to get blocked at some point unless you read the user guide. So, rule number 1 of Unified Installer, read the user guide. What's rule number 2? Read the user guide. Seriously, it's not that long. It's 10 pages or so, but you'll kind of struggle with this unless you go through it. It really is quite simple. Read the user's guide. The WinRM configuration is the important part. There are 2 ways to go and configure WinRM for Unified Installer. 3 ways. You can do it via group policy, either domain-based group policy or local policy on the systems that you're running on, or you can do it using command line and group policy. Right? There is one part of the configuration on the installer computer that requires you to use group policy. So this first part here, and I'm not expecting you to read this, this is here for reference in case you don't read the user's guide, but this is here for reference. The first part, the credentials delegation piece here, can only be set by policy. This only has to be set on the system that you're running the installer from, so you don't have to go and set this in a lot of different places if you're using local policy, but it can only be set by policy. The second part here can be set either via the command line or from policy. Personally, I like to use policy to do it because it gives me a record of exactly what I've done, but the user guide does explain doing both. The target computers, the systems that I'm installing something on, this can all be done either via command line or via policy. So just to show you real quick what that looks like. So this is guy is actually continuing, and we'll see how far it's got before the end here. But the way I configure these in my lab environment here is using domain-based policy. You see I have one policy here targeting my client machine, which is actually the remote desktop server I'm running the Unified Installer from. I have another one here targeting my servers, and I don't have the ability to go and edit them because I'm not a domain admin. But if I logged in as an admin here, you'd be able to see that the policies I set are the ones that were on that prior slide. I thought I'd change that. My apologies. Troubleshooting. This is, again, an interesting challenge because we're doing a distributed installation. There's not a central location of logs that you can go and see where things are actually happening. So there's actually 3 different places that if you either have an issue and you need to troubleshoot it, or, like me, you're really impatient and you want to see how far things have really got, there's 3 different places you can go and look to watch for progress. There's actually a log for the Unified Installer itself. That's on the system that the Unified Installer is running from in the usual location. I'll show you that in just a moment. There's Orchestrator runbook logging. The runbooks that we use to do this are wide open in Orchestrator, and we don't delete them after we're done. So you can actually go and look at those runbooks and see exactly how we're doing this. Also, during execution, you can actually go and see where through that runbook in Orchestrator runbook logging that component has actually progressed. And after execution, you can go and see the results from those runbooks. We do full logging enabled in our runbooks that we insert during our bootstrap process. And then there's the individual component setup logs. So every component we're using its standard setup in a silent mode, so it's doing its standard logging, and the user guide has a reference to where exactly on those target systems each one of those log files is going to exist. So the installer login itself, I'm an old configuration manager SMS guy, so I use Trace for logging. Wally wouldn't approve, but I like it. So this is actually telling us everything that the installer itself is doing. So you can see the beginning. Here's where I started this before you guys arrived this morning. We can see as we're going through doing our check, here's where we're checking each one of the servers to see that it's configured the way we need it. So making sure that we've got admin access, making sure that CredSSP and WinRM is configured. Then around here, you'll see the actual installation starts, and it's telling us what the commands it's using for the actual remote bootstrap of Orchestrator and the prereqs for Orchestrator. But then once it gets down to actually doing the installation, you'll just see that it calls the runbook and monitors progress, but doesn't tell you the commands because the runbook itself is actually running those commands. That's still installing SQL, so I'll switch to a different system here. Okay, so this is one that I started. Again, this is the file system that only takes an hour and a half to complete. This is one that I started before you guys arrived. If I go and look at the Orchestrator server here, in my runbook designer for Orchestrator, here are the Unified Installer runbooks, and this is actually where we start. Let me scroll up here a little bit. So you'll see log history on each one of these. that you can actually go browse through and see every step through the runbook exactly what it is that's happened. And then, of course, there's also the component setup logs that you can go through as well. So, in summary, how many products are in System Center? One. And you do have the ability to install all of them in a single pass. It is a very specific scenario for installation. It is not for production deployment. I was required to make sure I said that at least 5 times during this session. I think I've said it 5 times now. We are installing all products from System Center as one. You can do it in somewhere between 2 and 4 hours. Question here? So the question is, I keep saying it's for evaluation, not for production, so how do you do it in production? Couple of ways to answer that question. If you're a smaller organization where a simple installation of System Center works with SQL on the local box and the component on one component per server, this can work for production for a smaller organization. It won't scale out to a larger deployment. So if you're a smaller organization, it can be used, and you need to look at the single server deployment supported clients to understand whether that fits you or not, and it's different per component. If you need to do a production deployment, you would use standard setup to do it. So there's a deployment guide that will tell you how to think about planning that and how to actually go through and deploy that. Our services organizations have automated ways to do this for large deployments. We actually looked at using those for the unified installer, but they are somewhat complex tools to operate. The term we used was they ship with a smart guy, so the consultant comes with the tools to actually do the deployment. But there is a deployment and planning guide for every single one of these components that will explain in detail exactly what you need to plan for and deploy these in production. So are we planning to produce a unified installer to be used in production? We don't have one today. We are certainly looking at what we can provide in the future, but have no commitment to what that is at this point. Okay, so how many screens does a basic installation take? The answer is not 422, 16. You only have to walk through 16 basic screens. If you have the USB key, you already have all the media you need to actually go and do this. So who really has a private cloud in their pocket? We all do. It was an amazing feat getting agreement for everybody internally within Microsoft to make this thing happen. My manager did all the work. He may be sat at the back of the room. You can try all of this functionality that we've produced in System Center 2012 relatively quickly. You need 8 servers. What I've neglected to mention is what we check for system requirements on those servers. We check that each one of them is a 2 processor, 2 gigabyte VM. So if you've got a Hyper-V host that can run 8 2 gig VMs, so it's probably around an 18, 20 gig host to do that, you can evaluate all of this private cloud functionality in a single pass. So that was what I had to present to you. We have about 15 minutes left for questions, comments. So at this point, if you have questions, if you could step up to the mic. Otherwise, I'll be around for a little while afterwards as well, if there's anything else you want to come talk to me about. Thank you.